Great. Okay. Great. All righty. So hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome to our book talk series at Medan. Medan is a nonprofit that builds technologies for journalists, and we also develop programmatic initiatives. We work with partners all over the world, from India to Brazil to the United States to South Africa and Kenya. And we are very interested in the kind of role of information and the role of content and of online safety in kind of contemporary internet societies. My name is Anshal Meena. I head up program strategy and operations at Medan, and really excited for this conversation with Anika Gupta, who is a personal friend, but also a brilliant author from whom I've learned a ton. So before we start, just some kind of basic ground rules about the webinar. This is being recorded and it's being live streamed to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And so we always make the recordings available, and actually our larger audience is on the live streams and on the recordings. And so this is part of our interests in promoting public discourse about the internet and the role of the internet in contemporary society. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function. We might run a few polls every now and then. But I actually got a ton of questions from attendees already. And so I'll mostly be channeling those questions. But if you do have a question, feel free to drop something into the Q&A and I'll do my best to highlight it. So without further ado, I just wanted to get started with actually the event introduction and talk about Anika and her book. So we're here to talk about Anika Gupta's new book from Simon & Schuster's imprint Tiller Press. It's called How to Handle a Crowd. It's about community moderation. And I've known Anika for years now. We met through the Center for Civic Media and our common work in Cambridge. While Anika was looking into comments, I was looking into translation and global journalism, and we found some common interests given Anika's global experience, her interest in the internet and ethics. And I've just found everything I've talked about with Anika, everything I've learned from her has just been so enlightening. So I'm really thrilled to welcome her today. So Anika is an author and digital consultant, and she writes about healthy online communities and the internet. And she worked as a science and technology journalist from 2009 to 2014 and lived for 5 years in New Delhi, India. And so I think her global perspective is really important to part of this, part of our conversation today. Then she moved over to work in product management for media companies, and most recently was at The Atlantic and National Geographic. So it's that hat between kind of product and journalism that I think helps Anika bring this really unique perspective to community moderation. And just to close out with the intro, is really that she has her master's in comparative studies from MIT, and she did her master's on online comments, and so this reflects a lot of her research, and did a bachelor's at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. And so before I introduce Anika, I just also want to just give a big shout out to the Center for Civic Media and our common friend, Ethan Zuckerman. The Center for Civic Media at MIT recently has closed as Ethan is moving on. And the center has been so essential to our work at Medan, to my own personal work as a researcher and author. And it's a center that really brought Anika and me together. So thank you everybody for coming. We'll hear some opening remarks from Anika, and then we'll go to Q&A. So thank you so much, Anika, for coming, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's wonderful to be here and have the chance to have this conversation with you. One of many amazing conversations you and I have had over the years. And it's great to talk with you about my book. I loved reading your book and learning from it. And so, this is part of an ongoing dialogue. In order to get started, you had asked me if I could pull together some key insights or ideas from the book and maybe just share some initial thoughts about how it came to be. So I did go ahead and put together slides, partly to help guide myself through that conversation. And I am going to go ahead and see if I can share those right now with all of us. So is everybody, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, I see the word agenda and I see a table of contents.
Amazing. Okay, so I will try and move through this quickly because I know we have a bunch of great questions from the audience and I'm very eager to hear them. So this is just a quick agenda of things that we'll talk about. I'll mention a little bit about me. You've already done a lot of that, so thank you. And then how I got started on the book and kind of what I tried to do with it. So about me, Anne already kind of summed this up, but I've worked in media for a really long time, starting out as a journalist and then moving over into the technology side of that, but always with a passion for the mission of journalism in society. Most recently, I'm an author of How to Handle a Crowd, but this book is actually the result of a project or a research interest that began many years earlier. And one of the things that I had done is when I was in graduate school, so I finished off, as Anne mentioned, I was working as a journalist, science and technology journalist. And towards the tail end of that, I had started getting involved in a lot more conversations and spaces that were much more what we would think of as like participatory journalism. And so I was really interested in understanding that space better. And so I went to graduate school and I decided to write my master's thesis on the topic of online comments. And so that's, it's when I say that to people, I often hear like exclamations of surprise and groans because people, the comments have a terrible reputation and often rightfully deserved terrible reputation. Around the time that I started really studying them, which was 2014, 2015, a lot of news organizations had actually begun shutting down their comment sections. And many of them said it was because they found that the comment sections had just become really hard to manage. They saw a lot of what they defined as toxic discourse in comment sections, people leaving negative comments, people not really engaging in discussion. And so I became interested in this tragedy of the comments. I realized that my screenshot here is in some ways is actually from the New York Times, which is not a tragic comments. They're one of the examples of a comment section that in some ways has really thrived, partly because the Times pays such close attention to what happens in their comments. And their comments are actually, they get a pride of place on story pages and are really visible. But I was really interested in understanding for so many news organizations, how did comments end up so tragic? And so I started looking at like some of this research that existed around like how journalism was interacting with participatory online institutions. I have here a quote from like the very famous Jay Rosen, a wonderful researcher, who said, who referred to the people formerly known as the audience are simply the public made realer, less fictional, more able, and less predictable. And so I was really interested in how these people formerly known as the audience, this much more real public, was manifesting in comments. In looking further into comment sections, I also wanted to understand where both the design and the culture of comments came from. So typically when we think of, a comment section, you're envisioning this sort of little area, often at the bottom of a larger page, where people are having like some sort of discussion and you've got comments one after another. Sometimes they're threaded, sometimes not. But why do they look that way? Why did that become such a common mode? And so I've included kind of a quotation here that illustrates what I started uncovering there, which is that, the comment section wasn't really something that was designed for journalism or its goals. And I think that was one of the challenges that I began to uncover when looking at how media organizations handled comments is they had this great and ambitious goal a lot of the time. They wanted to create public conversation. They wanted to have discourse around issues of national importance. But commenting was really just the result of what was technically feasible at a certain point prior in time. And then that sort of, some of those interface decisions, the distinct culture of commenting, which we often thought of as being very negative, driven by short comments, often by personal attacks, a lot of these cultures grew out of digital constraints. And I think that was a really interesting insight on how interfaces really shape conversation. and then furthermore, kind of looking into how journalists felt about it, here's another kind of idea or quotation, which was, if there was no convention of internet commenting, if it wasn't this thing that was accepted, you would think it was a crazy idea. And to add a little, context here, this comes from a larger, comment about how it's just, kind of crazy that people can go onto a news organization webpage and write whatever they want at the bottom of it. And that really our acceptance of that being a way to even converse or have a say really grew out of the idea that there was this culture and idea of online commenting that had grown out of what was technically feasible many years earlier, kind of been grafted onto the news page, and then people just said, okay, well that's a thing that exists now. And so I think what I wanted to emphasize through all of this was that in many ways, what we had when we thought about like internet commenting, especially on news web pages, wasn't necessarily intentionally designed. It was a combination of things that have been inherited and assumed. And so I found myself asking this question of, if you were to move away from this question of add an interactive space somewhere on a news article page, if you were to think about what kind of went wrong, it was that we were asking this question of like, okay, people are on the internet, they expect interactivity. Do you add an interactive space somewhere on a page? But they weren't asking, how do you have a conversation about the news? And what does that mean? And how does that feel? And who does that? And I think that those were two really interesting questions. I think now in 2020, this question, a lot of these things feel we started asking those questions a lot more. So I think we started moving away from some of those inherited ideas, in particular the comment section. Many organizations don't have them. But this work really helped set the stage for me for thinking about how we create and sustain online communities. And in particular, when talking to people who are really responsible for comment sections, I started talking to a group of people who would later come to form the core of this book. And I would say this group would be the moderators. And so what are moderators, and why did I choose to continue to focus on them? I mean, one of the key reasons, of course, is because I started having great conversations with people, even when I was a graduate student, who were working in news organizations and dealing with communities and comments and that culture. And they had really interesting perspectives on what was possible online and what was possible within journalism. But I also began to see that moderators create communities. And when I say communities, I'll have a definition of community a little bit later on. But I think community is a tough thing to define in one single way. But one of the things I noticed is that there were often these folks, especially in communities that have been running for a long time, called moderators. They had huge importance, but we didn't necessarily understand a lot about their role or what they did. Community moderators, which is the group that I was really interested in. So they often would have access to information and tools that other members of the community didn't in order to moderate. And they could make decisions about who joined the community, what participation looked like, what people talked about. So they were incredibly powerful individuals. And their decisions made a huge difference to whether their communities succeeded or failed. And so I wanted to better understand, like, what does it mean to be a moderator? How do you become a community moderator? And what are some of the challenges that you face? And how do moderators kind of run their communities? And that really became the focus. It's something I talked about a lot in that graduate research, but it really became the focus of this book, wherein I looked at, I interviewed community moderators from across the internet. So as I promised, I would mention what is an online community. I think that this is a question you have to engage with if you're writing this about this topic, but it's not an easy one. I actually found a definition from a couple of academics that I liked, just because it hit a lot of key things. And so they mentioned the people who come together for a particular purpose and who are guided by policies, including norms and rules, and supported by software. And so I think that this definition, people, purpose, policies, including norms and rules and software, was something that I could look at in my work. I could say, who are the people in this community? How are the moderators shaping the purpose alongside the members, alongside maybe the platform? What are the policies? And then how does that all interact with the software and the platform that the community is based on? I think that the other element of, the other thing I did also, in addition to looking at this definition, is I asked the moderators whom I interviewed how they defined community. And that's where the definitions got very interesting and very different. So I heard a lot of things like, well, we care about this topic, and if you care about this topic, then you can be a member of our community. Or from activists, I heard it's a sense of shared purpose and the desire to create a certain kind of change. From members of the first I mentioned, if you care about like this particular topic, that would be potentially from people who ran groups for fandoms or even for neighborhoods. But a lot of those definitions offered to me by people who self-identified as community moderators were ones that focused on a feeling, like how do you feel in this community? What do you care about? And a couple of them mentioned, an online community is a group of people who come through and show up for each other. And so that's quite different from this definition, of course. And I think both of those elements are really important. Whom did I profile? So if you read the book, you'll see this, but the book is broken out into 8 chapters, and each chapter either focuses on one particular group or on one type of groups. So the first chapter focuses on a group that Make America Dinner Again, that tries to create conversation across political divides, and that's a fascinating story. The second group delves into Pantsuit Nation and a group that actually grew out of it called Real Talk, but is much smaller. And it deals with questions of how do you talk about race online and what are different approaches to that topic. The third chapter, Neighborhood Groups and Numtot, talks about neighborhood groups. I talked to people who run, I talked to the founder and moderator of a really large community listserv, but I also talked to people who started Facebook groups for their local neighborhoods, kind of about the challenges and dramas and, how do you, and that was a very unique kind of interaction because you're managing relationships among people who often are going to see each other day to day. The fourth chapter tackles an online activist movement called Sleeping Giants. I talked to both of the founders about how they kind of built that movement. And they deal with a topic that is really central to the internet, but hard to kind of explain, which is programmatic advertising. And they've turned that into a cause. They've also had a fair number of challenges along their journey. So I talk about that. I talked to one of the founders about what it felt like to be doxxed. The fifth chapter covers, I was really interested personally in looking into the world of MMOs or online multiplayer games. And so I talked to people who run guilds or cooperative groups that play World of Warcraft together, which is an extremely fun chapter to write. The sixth delves into Reddit, and I talked to the moderator of a really active fan subreddit. YouTube creators, and I profile a particular creator who's tried to create his community and grow it over time. And then in the 8th chapter, I actually talked to somebody who works on a site called FetLife, which is a site, it's kind of a personal site and community for people who identify as kinky, and he runs this massive group for newcomers. So that conversation raised a lot of interesting questions about how do you handle both educating people about something they're interested in, but also how do you handle a whole bunch of newcomers in this kind of environment and keep them kind of on track and prevent your group's culture from being hijacked or run off the rails. And got some great insights there. So what do moderators do? I realize we're getting close to the time I should stop talking, so I'm going to try and move through this fairly quickly. But I wanted to give you all a sense of kind of some of the things that were valuable. So here's a quick list of a very non-exhaustive list as I was thinking through this, a few days ago in preparation for this, of some of the things that a lot of the moderators I spoke to did on a regular basis. Building relationships, setting community norms, handling abuse, defining the boundaries of the conversation in the community, and then also de-escalating tension and relieve potential disruption. And that last is a really valuable skill set that some of the moderators whom I talked to who had actually received some kind of training talked about as well. So build relationships. I've outlined here some of the types of relationships that moderators are building one-on-one with members of their community, among moderators, with members. They're also building relationships with the platform. Setting norms is another thing I talked about. And so I talked to a lot of moderators about how do you create and draft rules. And so they talked about how do you how do you write rules that are flexible, that evolve, and that are not ambiguous, which is actually a really challenging point because things can be ambiguous that you might not initially assume are ambiguous. How do you resolve disagreement when it arises? So that includes not just disagreement among members, but disagreement about your actions as a moderator. And then govern. So they help promote the policies and agenda of the group. They'll mention what's on and off topic. They'll manage posts. A lot of the moderators I talked to, not all, but many, talked about how they handled abuse, and that could take many forms. Abuse could be members of their community getting upset at them. It could be people who weren't members of their community coming in and trying to destroy their community. In one case, it involved people who disliked the moderators of a particular community harassing them on other platforms where they weren't moderators. And so really, I mean, there was a lot of conversation around how abuse manifested and how they handled it. And here I talked a little bit, on this slide, I talk a little bit about some of the ways in which, abuse appeared for people and some of the challenges it evoked. And so, of course, something that shouldn't surprise any of us in this day and age is that abuse intersects with identity. So for moderators who identified with a marginalized identity, especially openly in their community, this would often have a very personal dimension. They talked about distancing and creating emotional distance or physical distance, sometimes stepping back from a topic, sometimes tapping in another moderator, but sometimes creating emotional distance within themselves. The phrase toughening up is the type of thing I'm thinking of. And it also affected relationships among moderators and community members, because how you handle abuse and what you flag as abuse changes how the community views you. So I had initially included like a lovely case study of one of these groups in here, and that was the Make America Dinner Again group, which is a really interesting one. In the interest of time, I won't go into the details of that, but it is all in the book. So this is what can others learn? I think there are a lot of things that other people can learn about moderation from reading about these other moderators. But for people who are interested in starting online groups, I was also trying to think through like what are some valuable ideas and lessons. And so I think some of the things that came out of talking to these moderators are as follows. One, of course, was to think realistically about the question of scale. I talked to groups that were anywhere from like maybe a few hundred members to like a few million. And I can tell you that for groups that are a few million, that moderation task becomes enormously harder. I also talked to people who intentionally kept their groups small. So I mentioned, Rail Talk, a group earlier that deals with conversations around race, and they were very clear. They would go through and remove inactive members. They weren't interested in having the biggest discussion possible or the biggest membership possible. And so I think this question is, how many members can you thoughtfully moderate and at the depth that you want to reach? The other is one-on-one. I think that a lot of times people think of moderation as being actions that occur in like the publicly visible spaces of the group. And that includes things like responding to a comment or moderating a post or removing a comment. But many of the moderators I spoke to spent time either in small group or one-on-one discussions with community members, reaching out, diffusing tension, helping somebody phrase something differently so that they stayed in the community, but maybe didn't offend somebody else. And so how do you provide feedback and counseling in kind of a one-on-one way? How do you use that? Where does your platform permit that? Questions. So especially for groups that were really interested in sparking discussion, how do you kind of approach questions and what questions should you ask of your community? And so a couple of different strategies emerged here, but one of the things that one of the moderators told me is, you want to ask detailed and provocative questions, but you also want to mix in potentially lighter fare. And that gives people a chance to get to know each other, and it gives them a chance to kind of jump in on a topic that maybe isn't necessarily immediately going to be very heavy and potentially controversial. Then engagement. One of the things that I also noticed is that in a lot of these groups, moderators didn't just approve a post or a comment and then disappear. A lot of times, many of them had shifts. They would be on, someone was on duty pretty much all the time. And they were not only watching the conversation, but many times jumping in as it continued to evolve, even before it became toxic. And I think that was a key learning too, is that, one of the people who started a group mentioned to me, she said, we had initially thought, okay, like people can use an emoji when they need a moderator to jump in, but that didn't work because they noticed that by the time moderators would get tagged into a thread, things were already really bad. So she said, we realized that the emoji wasn't enough and we had to really be there more consistently. And then the final thing is this idea of closed groups. I think this is a really tough topic in online communities. It might be one we return to later. People may have questions about it, but is around this question of whom you include. In general, in my observations, and I'm always open to other people's arguments, but I think that perfect inclusivity is really neither possible nor a good goal. And what I mean by that is that I don't know if there's an online community you can create where everybody who wants to, everyone who wanders in will feel happy and welcome. I think that in order to create that sense of purpose we talked about, you have to create some differentiation, like who are the people you're going to admit, who are the people you're not going to admit. And that could do with like how, their rhetorical style, how do they talk online? It could be their interests, it could be a lot of other things. Sometimes those decisions are explicit, sometimes those decisions are not made by you as the moderator, but maybe made by the platform on a level you don't see. They're also made by, things like who has access to the tools that you're using. And tools include things like language as well as technology, as well as connection. So I think being very aware of the boundaries of your group, both what you're intending to create, but also the ways in which unintentionally maybe your group is going to be limited, is really valuable to understanding what type of community you're going to be able to sustain, and the limits and the possibilities of the conversation you can have. Great. I think we can move quickly past this. This was just me outlining a couple scenarios that like benefited from, creating online communities to discuss them. Great. Okay. And those are the end of my kind of slides and discussion. And I realized that took a little longer than intended, but hopefully it was interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and this was such a fantastic overview of the book. And one thing I just really appreciated about the book was how human you made these stories, right? I could tell you really spent time with these folks, and you really kind of told the story of what it's like to be a moderator. I think that's something that's often missing when we're talking about online content, is that there are real human beings behind all of this work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and they're it's labor. It's like real human labor, isn't it? That you're talking about.
It's really hard. And thank you for saying that. I think I was also really interested in just understanding like the stories of people who are moderators, and especially the stories of people who are moderators of like large groups or groups that have had a challenging history, because it's just because there's absolutely that really strong human dimension. Yeah. Always.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think one thing, one question that really has come up for me as reading your book, I was rereading it last night to prepare for this, is it's like, okay, we're in this moment, this highly politically contentious moment in the United States and around the world, and there's tons of polarization. We see a lot of hate. We see a lot of violence online. Should we be thinking about community moderation as a profession? Are people starting to talk about that? And what does it look like to actually take the learnings from your book and apply that to the specific challenges we're facing today?
Yeah, such a great question, because I think you kind of get into questions of what actually defines a profession. But to answer your question, I think it's actually worth distinguishing here between different types of moderation too, because I've talked a lot about community moderation. So not all of the people whom I spoke to in my book are people who started out as volunteer community moderators. So they were interested in a topic, they got online, they, either they kind of nominated themselves or were nominated by others to become moderators. In some cases, they started the community. So that's one type of moderator. And those are moderators who are often super visible in their communities. They're like making decisions. People often know who they are. They're really kind of in the crux of all of the human relationships that keep the community going. And so the folks I talked to, many of them for the most part were still volunteers. They weren't necessarily getting paid by a company to moderate. There are moderators who get paid, and people who identify as moderators who get paid in order to do that work. And there are so many different places in which that happens. So that can be like, companies hiring a community liaison or a customer service person to help manage like community forums or community relationships. You see that a lot with like gaming or technology companies, as well as many others. And so that's one aspect of it. There's folks who are, managing communities on behalf of brands. And so they're doing community management kind of as a profession. And then you also have, and we've seen a lot of conversation about this recently, people who work as contract moderators. And a lot of times those are folks who are contract moderation actually happens in a lot of different areas and industries, but it's gotten a lot of attention because a lot of large tech companies will hire contract moderators. And I think, and those are folks who are often in a very invisible role. They're not paid a lot. They're dealing with like content that other people flag as objectionable. They're facing a lot of like trauma as a result. So that is a job. I don't know if I would say it's a career, because I don't think people intend to do it, for the course of over the course of like a very long time. And that's also, I mean, that's part of the challenge of that role. But those are folks who are being paid a lot of times by somebody who's been contracted by a large tech company in order to do that job. So different types of moderation, varying levels of professionalization. But to kind of answer your question, I think it's still, even in the realm of what I saw and the people whom I talked to, I think that's such a good question, because I think one of the big questions that came up, especially for a lot of my moderators who had started groups that became very large and very successful, is this is a lot of work. How do we reconcile the fact that we do it and we love it with needing to, make money and live? And I think there were different approaches to this, but it came up repeatedly in conversation. So I think, I think that's a very real question. I think also, I would agree that I think it would be very interesting to start thinking about moderation, if not as a profession, then definitely as a field where you could have moderator conferences, or for that matter, some kind of consistent moderator training. So a couple of the groups I talked to, one had had a formal moderator training process, and that actually included doing a lot of walkthroughs with potential moderators and teaching them certain skills and that's detailed. Others had informal training. It's kind of yeah, you're on the job now, and we'll show you what we do, and here's some tools I use, but good luck. And I think there's enough commonality among the things that moderators need as community moderators, and the things that they often do and do well, that it would be helpful to have more community around that particular, not just around that type of work. And those exist. There are communities of moderators on various different platforms, but I think overall, having some sort of training, some sort of acknowledgement of the fact that it's work, what skills are required, how to keep people motivated, how to build better resources, absolutely huge need for that. Moderation is a larger and larger part of our lives every day, and it's very hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was just really struck by that in the book, and just in our own day-to-day work at Medan. Mm-hmm. It's struck by the kind of amount of labor that's involved. And I think your book just really tells that story. I want to go to a question that Salil Tripathi from PEN America has put forth, and I'm actually going to mash it up with a few other questions. So Salil's question is taking many moderators are volunteers, and companies like Facebook rely on outsourcing our technology to moderate conversations. And often that's about sensitive topics, and they may not be aware of the local sensitivities, and might even be susceptible to local politics. And this is actually relates to questions that other folks in the group have asked, is how do you apply international standards in different cultural settings? How can we think about standards and policies that make sense at internet scale? And again, I know you're looking at the kind of smaller communities, but it seems like when you're talking about the whole field here, it seems like the internet is necessarily international, even if most of the platforms are built locally. So in many ways, I'm just kind of curious, what do you think are the possibilities for standards around training, around moderation, et cetera, especially at the international context?
Yeah. I'm glad that you asked that question. So I will say that the groups that I profile in the book are based in the United States, and that was somewhat of a pragmatic decision. It was just people whom I reached out to and was able to line up. And but that said, especially because I worked internationally for so long, I think there are so many. There are some really interesting. There are many interesting stories in the space that are outside the United States. Based upon what I've observed, I would be hesitant to say that we can or should create standards for moderation or communities that can cut across, that can apply at such a large scale. And I think one of the reasons I personally am hesitant to say that is because, again, a lot of the groups I looked at were based in the US. And I think that's a really interesting point you brought up about how the internet is global. A lot of the communities that I looked at felt very local. And I don't mean local to the United States. I mean, they felt local to a very specific set of concerns, a very particular context, right? I mean, community is so dependent on context. Moderators are just basically handling context all day long. And so I think I actually think that's one of the challenges that a lot of the large platforms face, is they're trying to create like standards for content and what's appropriate and what's reasonable that are not international, and they do often come up against the fact that their standards don't respect, like, you know, sensitivities and cultures and perceptions in many parts of the world. So I don't know. I would love to see more successful examples of that happening. I personally think that it's better to give moderators and communities, in some cases, greater autonomy. I realize the challenge in that, because, you know, many moderators are not, you know, like democratically elected. But it's one of the challenges, and one of the ways in which online communities and how they operate can't be grafted onto like nations. Yeah, I don't know. That's not a hugely satisfying answer. Sorry, Salil. I haven't seen too many cases where I was like, this is a rule that works. Now, I mean, that said, I mean, I say that the groups I talked to were, you know, local, and some of them had members who had lived in other parts of the world or were currently living there, who had chosen to buy into like the rules and standards of that particular community and were comfortable there. But that was a choice they made. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question, and I think you had a great answer, which is that we need to study and learn, right? I think one thing that when we look at the history of international human rights law and human rights standards, those took decades to come together and really get every country to sign on to that. And so your call for more research to like kind of look at this, I think felt very appropriate, actually, to kind of the nature of the challenge here, which is thinking about international kind of content standards.
Yeah, I think you have to have, I think any attempt at making those kind of standards, there has to be some larger assumption of good faith on the part of the actors who are engaged in doing it. And when you think today about like a lot of the, like, who would those actors be? Like, you know, where does that come? I mean, we're already struggling at a global level to make joint policy decisions as humans on this planet on like so many levels. Like, you know, so I don't know. I think that's also part of my hesitation when asked about how to do this.
Yeah. And so moving from the macro, we started off with like this big macro problem. Sorry to throw such a tough question at you. Let's move to the micro. Another question from the audience is like, okay, we're in this context now. We're all extremely online. You know, we got family, friends, all our get-togethers, workplaces, classrooms. We're all online now. And so your book kind of lands at this exact moment when in many ways we're all community moderators for our own like micro communities. So what are the lessons here? What can kind of the average person talking, you know, trying to run a Viber group or a Slack chat, what can we learn from the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that such a good question. I wrote this book like with no idea that the world was going to end up where it is today. And then it came out and suddenly, you know, wow, talk about a crazy set of circumstances. So I think there are a lot of things. I think if depending on the scale of the group you're trying to run, and kind of, I think that one of the things that you can certainly take away from this book is how do you create like a sense of, well, I guess a couple of things. The first would be like strategies for how to even build your group in the first place. Like, whom do you let into your group? Are there different ways to like look at people's profiles? If you're on like, you know, a platform that lets you like do some sort of like filtering, like asking questions, etc., of potential members, what kind of questions can you ask to try and like, you know, and what can you look at to like, you know, determine who is this person who's trying to come into my community and do I want them there? It can help you think through things like, I talked a little earlier about like ambiguity and guidelines. I think that's a huge challenge. So I think it can help you. And when I say ambiguity, what I mean is like terms that we think have some sort of inherent definition, like hateful, do not. You know this because you spent a lot of time thinking about it. But a lot of people might say, oh, we know what's bigoted. We know what's hateful. We know the reality is people disagree about what that is. So I think you have to as a moderator, then you have to think about, in my guidelines, don't just forbid, hateful speech. You have to say, you have to actually define, like, what does that look like in the context of this group, and like what sort of actions and words are going to get you banned, and so, or removed or adjudicated by moderators in some way. And so I think that'll help you kind of think through it. And how do you like message those rules to people? I think another big area that it can help you think through is like, how do you address and bring in feedback from your community? So there are different ways to think about this. I mentioned earlier that moderators are not democratically elected, but some moderators of really large groups are aware that and want to offer mechanisms for members of the community to offer feedback to them on how they moderate. And so there are a couple of examples of how you can try and do that. There's also an avenue whereby you don't really do that as much. I wouldn't necessarily encourage it, but I think that there are a couple different approaches to thinking through like that question. And then finally, of course, like, how do you get into the day-to-day of like, what does it mean to like de-escalate a tough situation? How do you, like, let's say you're talking about a particular topic and you want to like give people some certain grounding, or you want them to come in with certain awareness and sensitivity. How do you put, that material in? I think one of the really interesting things that the book offers is glimpses into how moderators like actually like break one large discussion into many different pieces of discussion and layers of discussion in order to make the overall discussion stronger. And I think that's something a lot of people don't think about. So, and what I mean by that is like, you have like the conversation that happens in a space that maybe all members of the community can see, but moderators are also maybe having some folks like have a separate conversation in a separate space, whether that's like a group chat or like a one-on-one or, a whole separate like room. And they're doing that to help them create like dialogue and then maybe even bring that back to the main group. So like, I think especially if your group is larger or if your group is dealing with like more controversial topics, thinking through how you can like kind of create layers of conversation. That's an interesting strategy. How to recruit other moderators. There's some in there about that. So there's a lot. There are a lot of things that you could think about. It's the clear takeaway from it, of course, is that moderation is it is time consuming if you're doing if you're putting time and energy into making your community grow. All right.
So I'm having, okay, I was having some connection issues. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, great.
I can hear you. Okay.
Great. Okay, perfect. So going into some of the practicalities of this, I feel like I want to like take that snippet that you just said and turn it into a blog post. Anika's tips for like your day-to-day life, how to work with your family, how to work with your friends, your coworkers, and one thing is this eternal challenge. You talk about open versus closed. How do online communities vet members while remaining accessible to newcomers? How do you strike that balance there?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a couple different approaches. So I talked about, I mentioned that in one of the chapters of the book, I interviewed a moderator who runs this really large group for newcomers to kink. It's on FetLife. And so he had some great insights about like how you handle that, because really the structure of his group. So, FetLife is it's a closed community. You have to sign up for it. But once you're in there, you can join this group. It's a public group. And because it's called like newcomers, it's intended for novices and people who are new. The structure of the group demands that it be somewhat open and accessible to newcomers. So he can't just, close it off and be like, no, we only have people who are a certain way. And so I think that in that case, I think it was a lot of, and admittedly, this was like a huge challenge. Like he and I talked about the challenge of this. And so I think one of the things that he said, of course, is that they had a very elaborate rules structure, like not just a whole lot of rules, but like they reiterated the rules in their group at multiple points and in multiple places. It could be in like responses to posts. They had stuff pinned at the top. They had individual blog posts made by the members of the moderating team being like, here are things that we talk about. Here's why our rules exist. So, he said there are still people who like don't read the rules, and sometimes people who feel like they don't have to. And so you have to be prepared to kind of repeat them fairly frequently. They had several moderators on their staff who were all kind of focused on helping to deal with this challenge of like newcomers who don't necessarily know the rules, again because it was a community for newcomers. And I think we talk about newcomers, the reason I'm talking about like newcomers in particular is because like that's a big challenge as a moderator. You know, you have like people coming into your community who may be great, but like unintentionally they may violate the rules or disrupt the culture because they don't understand how you relate to each other or what you're doing there. So you have to like, I think as a moderator, one of your key initial tasks is you have to like guide people to either become members of your community or guide them to depart, you know, if they are not necessarily the people whom you want. And so the challenge is like, how do you do that? And so I think one of those things was like continuing to repeat those rules everywhere. Another is, I mean, you know, if you don't necessarily need to be that open, but you still would like to have, I think, of course, the question is like, why do you want newcomers in your group? And like, what are you hoping for? Are you hoping for diverse perspectives or different ideas? Or are you hoping for like growth kind of in some broad sense? So if you're interested in like newcomers because you want to continue to bring new perspectives in, then I think it also helps, even if you employ like some sort of questionnaire or, you know, some sort of filtering mechanism, to be pretty transparent about what it is you're looking for in group members. So you can say up front, like, we're really interested in people who are willing to talk about these topics, but like in XYZ way, et cetera. And so that kind of helps people realize that they can be part of your group. But it also makes it clear like that there's certain rules for that engagement. And that's something you can do upfront, even at the level where like people are like, you know, saying, oh, I want to join your group. So I think those are a couple of different ways. I mean, I think not every group is open to newcomers. Some groups, maybe they don't want to be or they don't need to be. I think those are some of the ways to approach that challenge. And there are also other, I mean, as you think about like how your moderation strategy evolves, like you can also approach, like if you have a newcomer and you do have to moderate them for doing something that violates the rules, think about the type of violation or allow them like a certain number of, and many moderators will talk about this, whether or not it's spelled out. They'll be like, yeah, you know, that's a person who we haven't seen them violate the rules before, so we'll give them some benefit of the doubt. Or this is somebody who occasionally makes, you know, has made violations, but, you know, so I think like if you're like, oh, we know this is a new member, then like take a moment, and you think they could be valuable, take a moment, maybe pull them into a one-on-one, be like, hey, you know, what's going on? Here's what's going, here's how we usually talk about this. Are you open to that? Those are just some of the ways to think about it. Yeah, if you're one of those groups that wants to continue to invite newcomers.
Absolutely. I'm keeping my video off just by my connection suddenly got fuzzy. So, but I think again, like what you highlight is just how much human work is necessary and just the context, knowing the context and everything. And so I just really appreciate the detail you go into. Moving into actually some of these kind of very human struggles. In the book, you talk about, you know, the experience of one of the founders of Sleeping Giants being doxxed. And we know this is not an unusual experience. And so one of the questions from our group, I'm actually going to mash up two questions. One from the audience before, which was, you know, how do we design a feminist response, especially to trolls that attack women or issues related to gender? We know that the experience that you highlighted it disproportionately impacts women on online platforms. And then secondly, and we just got this question from Carol Dewanle, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, is are moderators also thinking about, you know, the role to play in addressing and correcting misinformation or harmful information? And so kind of like basically like misinformation, hate, attacks on women. How are moderators dealing with this, and how do moderators design policies that address some of these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are like a couple levels at which that question operates. And I think the first level, of course, is like, how do you as a moderator contend with this problem? The larger level is like, how do a lot of these conversations are taking place on like large, let's say potentially like software platforms that are making their own policies and rules about things like hate that may not accord with your views as a moderator. And so it's kind of like, how do I as a moderator deal with actually the platform's sometimes bad decisions around like what does and does not constitute hate, or how they allow people to interact with me. And so those are like two different like layers of it, I think. But I just wanted to be clear that like when it comes to challenges of hate, also we cannot absolve technology of its role in promoting that. or permitting it. And so I think, like, with that said, I think the question of like, how do you design a feminist response operates, I guess there are two kind of ways to think about it. One, of course, is like, you as a leader of a group, do you like, what is your goal? Do you want like just that behavior to stop in your community, or do you want to try and like, I don't know, reform that person or improve their attitudes? I think that those are two different challenges. I think when it comes to like people, how do you design a feminist response? I think that especially if you want your response to be like actively tagged as feminist, this is where you can think about like, in your particular group's guidelines, like, what do you point to for why you've created the guidelines that you have? And you can say upfront, like, here are some of the principles that we, like, I talked to a group that, not necessarily feminism, but that was related, that was talking about race. And they said, look, here are our kind of founding ideas and principles about how racism operates in society. And you have to buy into those in order to be a member of the group. And so you can say, like, you can make feminism part of those core principles. And then you can also say, when you define, like when we said, you know, you don't just want to say for no hateful comments, define the types of things that you consider to be hateful and the perspective that you want. You know, I talked to one moderator, and he said that, you know, in our group, we just do not make comments that like devalue women's labor or diminish their bodies, or, you know, I mean, there's like a very particular kind of perspective on that. And so that's kind of how you can like signal that this is like a feminist response. I think, and then of course, you know, try and remove members of that of the community or people who are, you know, behaving in that way. I think that's, those tools again are like sometimes very limited, again, because if you're operating on a platform where you don't control it, you know, like your tools, your ability to like ban members and remove them is going to be somewhat limited, and that's tough. So I guess I would say, like, if, especially if like feminism is important to you, like there are ways to signal that. There are a lot of organizations that have like done interesting work thinking through like how platforms can better prevent this particular kind of hatred from coming to the front. You know, I'm thinking of like, you know, Troll Busters and the International Women's Media Foundation. They've done some work around this also. I think also, you know, when I think about, I guess, a feminist response, I think the other part of it, of course, was like, are you trying to reform somebody's behavior? I think that's super challenging. And I don't think it's necessarily, it's like a thankless task on many occasions. But I will say that, like, you know, talking to some, spending time on the internet and then talking to like some moderators, one of the things they said is that occasionally they would get like a really, I mean, not occasionally, often, they would get like a really aggressive or unpleasant or expletive filled message, being like, y'all are stupid, like, why the, you know, like, whatever, are you doing this, etc. And sometimes they would ignore it, but sometimes, and this actually happened with Nandini of Sleeping Giants, she told me that every so often when she had a lot of emotional reserves, she would respond and just try and be polite and friendly and be like, hey, sorry you're having such a rough day. Like, what's going on in your life? And sometimes that would not work, but that sometimes people would be so taken aback. Her exact phrase was, you know, sometimes people are itching for a fight and I just don't give it to them. And then the person would say, oh, you know, like, sorry, I was like so rough with you at first. Like, it's been a weird, you know, couple of months, etc. And so that's like one way if you want to like actually try and have some kind of dialogue with like a person. But I don't know. I would hesitate to encourage that as some kind of blanket policy because I think it's very costly.
Yeah, that's so it's such a good question, such a difficult question, and yeah. In terms of like how do you address these, it feels like an ongoing dialogue. And again, I just want to take everything you said and turn it into like a little blog post. Here's Anika's guide to working with online communities. I know that's basically what the book is, but I feel like you're
a little bit. The questions you're asking are like really inviting me to like extract out things that are and are not explicit. It's a tough question. It's a tough question because I think, and I suspect you might agree, is that a lot of the responsibility it belongs to people who are not the moderators in those cases.
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah. And these are the tough questions coming from our audience because we have a lot of folks who are like in the trenches doing this daily work, and so so again, I really appreciate the audience questions here. So as we're kind of wrapping up now, we're close to time for the webinar. I just want to, again, thank everybody for coming. I did put a link to Anika's book. I put a survey so you can give feedback on the event. But Anika, do you have any final thoughts to say? Anything you want to just kind of close out with for the webinar?
No, I just wanted to say this was a pleasure. I loved writing this book in part because I mean, you mentioned the book is very human. I just really I really appreciate the people who kind of opened up the doors and were willing to tell me so many details about their lives and their work. And what it takes to be a moderator. It's so hard and so great. And now, of course, we're all going to have to be, more moderators than we expected. And so it's really great to have like these stories of people who are doing this voluntarily and at such cost to themselves. And I hope people will read it and take away both appreciation for their work, but also appreciation for ways in which we should all be like advocating to make it better and more respected and
Absolutely.
improve the tools. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Fantastic book, Anika Gupta, How to Handle a Crowd, The Art of Creating Healthy and Dynamic Online Communities. It's available through Tiller Press. It's a Simon & Schuster imprint. You can get a pasted the link to the chat, and you can also find it at your local library. And if it's not there, you can request it and then help promote Anika's work as well. So thank you so much, Anika. Fantastic talk, wonderful book, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. And thanks to everybody for coming.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to all of you who are here. Really appreciate it. It was great to see your names.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Okay, bye-bye.